Nature of Society Part 4, Session 10R. It is perhaps necessary to return to how infrastructure, transportation, and environmental conservation would be treated in an SVT environment. We said last week that one common phenomenon of developing countries throughout the world is poor infrastructure. Poor roads and bridges, poor drainage, poor water supply and sewage disposal, and poor public transportation systems. This is as much due to poor funding, but also poor planning cultures, and distinguishes developing countries from developed ones. SVT allows countries to efficiently plan and implement adequate civil infrastructure, with everyone paying his way and having a vested interest in ensuring that the infrastructure is maintained and improved over time. Local government bodies would have direct jurisdiction and responsibility for the upkeep of their local infrastructure, excluding those pieces of infrastructure best managed by central governments, such as major highways, major waterworks, and major transportation systems. We also said that, under SVT, local governments can set and collect a portion of the tax for its infrastructure and other expenses, as each local government jurisdiction is different in nature from the other in terms of physical size, population, and economic activity. The taxes applicable would be diverse and would require negotiation and collaboration for an agreed sum to be arrived at. This sum should not go below an absolute minimum percentage of the national annual budget. Within the local government bodies, expenditure priorities should be set in conjunction and consultation with burgesses, which should be the basis of a satisfactory relationship between local government politicians and burgesses. Meetings and interactions could be set up both digitally through websites and emails, and physically through town hall meetings to ensure that interaction and feedback takes place. Are there any comments or questions on these, having had a week to consider them? Next, had a look at national transportation, and we said that national transportation networks are another feature that sets developed countries apart from developing countries. If public transport systems can be developed that are reliable, safe, comfortable, and relatively inexpensive, this would lighten the burden considerably on the environment, the transportation infrastructure, and the level of stress on the roads in developing countries. Because this area of national life is never planned and managed, there is much chaos and confusion in most developing countries, with no prospect of improvements over time. For there to be any redemption here, a salient truth must be acknowledged, and this is that transportation networks, roads, railways, airports, seaports, are all valuable to the communities. They have site values, and persons wishing to use them or to have use of them should pay their portion of these site values. We continued with this annual payment, borne mainly by vehicle owners, light and heavy trucks, cars, will bear the major part of this expenditure because they are the main beneficiaries as well as the main impactors on the transportation systems. Persons using public transportation will have their share of the site value tax obligations included in their travel fares. The SVT obligations should be such that all state subsidies now become unnecessary. All uses of public infrastructure will now be free of state subsidy and should cover the annual capital cost of infrastructure, its upkeep and improvement. Rail travel, air bridge and sea bridge travel between different locations within a country which traditionally receives subsidy funding to provide the service should be a thing of the past. Under SVT, there is much more wherewithal by the consumer to afford the full cost of travel. As we said earlier, under SVT, the factors of production are balanced and the cost of goods and services become affordable for all those who labor, so the need to subsidize costs are not necessary. Persons would become more discerning about all expenditures and would choose the most efficient and cost-effective good or service. The point is that all national infrastructure should be adequately funded by its users, and those who value the use of this infrastructure greatest should pay more for its use, namely the light and heavy automobile owners. The users of water, sewage disposal, electricity, telephone, garbage disposal, and street cleaning all pay directly for these services because these persons value these directly. But users of other civil infrastructure, although they place great value on them, do not pay directly or not enough for them. This is why even in the developed world, civil infrastructure is badly maintained or in disrepair because of underfunding. SVT would correct this. Before we move on to what was said on environmental conservation, are there any further comments on how these items would be funded and become self-sufficient? We began on the subject of environmental conservation by saying the need for environmental impact assessments for developments being proposed would become even more essential in an SVT economy. Although sites may be deemed valuable, they should always pass the EIA test. Valuable sites should always be amenable to developments that are desirable to the community and not be undesirable or that can potentially render any harm to it. Environmental protection should also now be of the highest priority because more development will now be taking place. The need for effective garbage disposal systems, the need to monitor the effluent quality of the air and of water courses and rivers for pollutants and polluters should receive the support of the full force of law for compliance. Anti-pollution police should be a regular feature and presence in an SVT economy, with regular inspections and testing of the environment from a technically competent and committed police force. Such industries that utilize and discharge heavy metals and other possible pollutants into our air and water courses should be robustly monitored to ensure the most stringent compliance. Those who are in breach of the anti-pollution laws should face criminal as well as civil prosecution. The other areas that would also need vigorous monitoring would be the agricultural sector for harmful use of pesticides and fertilizers, groundwater for seepage for harmful pollutants, proper disposal of sewage, supervision of quarrying operations so that water courses are not polluted, management of our forest reserves. All these go toward the conservation of our environments and must receive the highest priority. The last area of conservation that has not received the appropriate attention by anyone is the conservation of the sea. Many countries are dumping their garbage and pollutants in the sea. This is an area that needs as urgent a response from the international community as do carbon emissions. Each country should be responsible for anti-pollution programs in its exclusive economic zone and should face heavy fines and penalties. Heavy fines and penalties by the international community for breaches. Let us have a break now. Concerning citizen involvement in environmental conservation, we said, there is clear evidence that in much of the developing world, environmental conservation is observed in the breach rather than in compliance of anti-pollution laws. Citizens have tended to have passive responses to environmental impact assessments. Inquiries by their below par attendance at such meetings and the lackluster participation when attending. In 2010, the World Bank had commissioned a survey on environmental governance in oil and natural gas industries in the developing world. Coming out of this survey were the following findings and recommendations. Firstly, EIAs should be conducted throughout the life of the project and not just before the commencement of it. Community members are only called upon to participate in them here, and the participation levels are found to be quite wanting in most cases. Because the project may pose a threat to the environment throughout its life cycle, the need for citizens to be vigilant is continuous. The monitoring authorities should also change their operations to effectively provide the technical and administrative capabilities to adequately do this. The second recommendation is that the authorities should provide the call, the infrastructure, and the encouragement for community members to attend and participate in the regular public consultations or environmental impact assessment inquiries. The industries must see themselves as having to surpass pre- and post-approval EIAs. The third recommendation from the World Bank advises that there should be free flow and wide dissemination of environmental information and data, with the possible consequences and social impacts stated publicly. This would require that all EIAs, pre and post, be published so that the public is always informed. The fourth recommendation made is that the developing countries must strive for a balance between the economic benefits to be had on a proposed project and the possible damage to be done to the environment in terms of air and water pollution, carbon footprint, ecological damage, spills, accidents, and fires. Countries should not only consider the economic benefits to be had. If the possibility of untoward pollution and accidents are present, enough safeguards and contingencies should be included to bring the risks to a minimum acceptable level. What do we make of these recommendations? We finally went on to say that environmental conservation and protection must be a collective effort from both the industries, the monitoring and enforcing regulators, the legislatures, and finally the receiving public. No one entity can do this alone if there is to be success. The great outcries that we are now hearing around the world can only be treated with successfully if we deal honestly and consistently with environmental conservation issues in every country of the world. This week, we will address the following whole question of urban sprawl, which is a direct result of sites being inaccessible through costs or otherwise. In every country of the world, there is this phenomenon of urban sprawl, which has consumed much resources, both financial, material, and human, for millennia. Urban sprawl occurs when human habitation must take place at areas that are far from the urban centers because of lack of affordable areas close to the urban centers. Resources must be expended to provide transportation, utilities, drainage, water, sewage and communication infrastructure, more than would otherwise be the case under an SVT economy. Under SVT, development would be more compact and not necessarily more crowded than is the case today, where we see vast tracts of unutilized land interspersed with lands that have crowded development. Notwithstanding this, there is a continuous need for greenfield sites upon which to establish housing estates and other sites for other economic activity. This is the unseen phenomenon that is negatively impacting the environment more than anything else. This constant attack on our forest reserves, which is bringing us into direct contact with wildlife species, which is causing mutually undesirable effects, the extinction of species of wildlife, and the contracting of new diseases in humans on an ongoing basis, is clearly unsustainable. Look at the stark reality at the annual loss of Brazilian rainforests of 25,000 square kilometers a year. This is indeed one of the vital lungs in the world, where the forest consumes carbon dioxide and produces oxygen for global human consumption. With this rate of loss, due to man's insatiable need for resources, the time would come soon when the Earth's ecological balance would irreversibly be impacted. Other forested areas on every continent of the world are also being seriously depleted. Environmental conservation in its true sense doesn't only mean anti-pollution policies or establishing a minimum carbon footprint, but utilizing land, labor, and capital in quantities that are just enough for the satisfaction of the reasonable desires of all men, such that the environment, including all other living creatures, can coexist and thrive well. This will require a fair amount of man's collective wisdom, and it also means, initially, the use of the land that is not iniquitous. Urban sprawl is the evidence that this is not the case, but the redeeming thing is that this can be corrected in the short to medium term. The need for correction is becoming even more urgent now because of the advent of climate change. While there is still some holdouts who are advocating that there is no such thing as climate change, there is irrevocable evidence that sea levels are rising. Atmospheric temperatures are also rising because of more greenhouse gases and pollutants being let into the atmosphere. The effect of these, as we are aware, are the greater frequency of rising floodwaters, which are damaging many of our seaside cities all over the world. The greater frequency and virulence of storms, tornadoes, and hurricanes, cyclones, and the greater prevalence of respiratory disease, asthma, bronchitis, etc., globally. All around the world, there is a concerned and an almost frantic search for solutions to these issues. But the search is not deep enough and would yield the answers and the desired solutions, and would not yield the answers and the desired solutions unless and until we begin to see our breach of the fundamental natural law of economic justice. What do we make of all this? Is there now a need for urgency, and are the measures proposed generally by commentators adequate to arrest the deleterious effects of climate change? We have come to the end of another term, and I dare say it has been another successful one. Next term, we shall be addressing such subjects as law and order, public and private sectors, natural resources and ownership policy, tax administration, administration implications for site value taxation, and finally the principles of land value tax assessment. Next term will be just as interesting as previous terms. See you in a few weeks, and I will be in touch with you by email and advertisement. Have a great holiday.